gives me great pleasure to welcome Noel Pearson to our convention. He spoke at an APIA convention quite some years ago, and I can assure him that the members are still talking about it. They've been hassling for a few years to get to come back. Many of the members have told me they're very pleased that he's accepted our invitation to once again offer a keynote address. Mr. Pearson was born in 1965 in Cooktown, North Queensland. After attending school at Cape York and in Brisbane, he received a degree in History and Law from Sydney University. For many years, he's campaigned for the rights of Cape York Aboriginal people and played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Cape York Land Council in 1990. He participated in the drafting of the Cape York Heads of Agreement, which ensured effective cooperation between Indigenous, conservation, mining and pastoral interests in Cape York. Mr. Pearson has been a chairman of the Cape York Land Council and still acts for the council in an advisory capacity. He works in a voluntary capacity as a team leader with Cape York Partnerships, and he's the director of the Cape York Institute. He's also worked on native title cases, including the historic Wick decision. He was also a member of the Indigenous negotiating team during the drafting of the Native Title Act in 1993. We're looking forward to hearing from him today, Mr. Pearson.
Thank you very much to the Australian Pipeline Industry Association for this really kind invitation for me to address this conference. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the Indigenous people of Cairns and this region. And can I acknowledge Parliamentary Secretary Michael Choi for his gracious comments. The Cape York Agenda is our attempt to think through what is needed for our Indigenous people to close the tragic gap between our people and other Australians. That gap is so well known that we're almost numb with the statistics. Perhaps the headline indicator of that gap is the life expectancy gap of around 20 years. And in places like Cape York Peninsula, the gap is in fact wider. You'd have to go to some parts of the former Soviet Union or sub-Saharan Africa to find such a life expectancy deficit. The life expectancy rates in India and in China are significantly higher than the life expectancy of this country's Indigenous peoples. Underpinning that life expectancy gap are a whole range of other miserable indicators: educational, health, involvement in the criminal justice system, and so on. 3% of the population are contributing between 20 and 40% of the country's prison populations. 3% of the country are contributing up to 60% of youth in juvenile detention. 3% of the country are contributing between 30 and 60% of children in foster care. Only in the National Rugby League and the Australian Football League are Indigenous people positively overrepresented. On every other indicator, we have a huge challenge ahead of us if the original peoples of the country are to share in the benefits of being an Australian. We've long known this. There's been lots of consternation by political leaders about this, going back many, many decades. Australia has been struggling with the, quotation marks, Aboriginal problem for most of the 20th century. And there has been large measures of goodwill and anxiety about the problem. And we've made many commitments at various junctures to try and close the gap and find solutions. In relation to the criminal justice system, perhaps the most significant attempt to solve the problems was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, a massive national exercise that investigated every death in custody during a certain period of time, came up with 339 recommendations and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of programs and responses were devised by territory, state and Commonwealth governments. 20 years later, the number of Indigenous people in custody have gone from, in 1991, around 2,000 people, to today, over 5,000 people in custody. All of our concerted intentions came to naught. In this state, we made a commitment between Indigenous leaders and the Beattie government to halve the number of Aboriginal people involved in the criminal justice system within 10 years. That was the goal we set 8 years ago. We are now tracking at 17% above the rate at the time we made the commitment. On most of the policy fronts affecting the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're not making progress. And the progress we are making in some areas is marginal and, frankly, not the consequence of deliberate policy. Yes, we are having greater Year 12 completions and university participation in states such as South Australia, but from all of the research it appears that this progress is being made quite notwithstanding government policy. So when we came to confront our problems 10 years ago, after we delegated to our colleagues the task of continuing the fight for justice, for land, and the proper implementation of the Wick and Mabo decisions, when we came to confront our parlous social predicament, we thought that we first had to get our thinking straight. We first thought that if our policies are failing, our thinking must be wrong. And my first look in detail at the Royal Commission's report into Aboriginal deaths in custody, it was plain to me that the Royal Commission had plainly failed to deal with the nose on your face problem of substance abuse. Instead, the Royal Commission had listed a long list of parameters: housing, employment, training, education, infrastructure, and so on. And substance abuse was said to be just one of a number of so-called underlying issues. You know, but there are issues and then there are issues. There are factors and then there are other factors. And the plain nose on your face factor seemed to us to be that we needed to confront the grog. Why were we having horrendous rates of magistrate court appearances, when if a cursory look over the lists would tell you that 90% of them involved grog? So we had to wrench governmental and community attention away from that traditional list of social justice to the patent fact that we needed to confront the grog problem.